Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Thoughtful Bro. I'm so happy to be here with you today with Oliver Burkeman, somebody who I guarantee you is going to bring your blood pressure down in these uncertain times. We're going to have a dose of sanity and hopefully optimism today, talking about his latest book, Meditations for Mortals. I want to tell you a little bit more about The Thoughtful Bro and Oliver before we get started. The Thoughtful Bro is here on most Tuesdays at 2 to talk about what makes great books tick and what makes great authors tick. We air, of course, on A Mighty Blaze, which is an all-volunteer initiative connecting writers and readers virtually. We started in COVID, and here we are. A Mighty Blaze is never asking for your money. If you love us or you want to support us in any way, you know what to do. Just click the like button, tell your friends about us, retweet us, and so on. Just pass the word around because there's a lot of other great shows on Mighty Blaze, as well as The Thoughtful Bro. If you are in the mood to spend money, I have an idea. You can spend it on fabulous books that will, again, bring that much needed dose of sanity to your life. Books like Meditations for Mortals by Oliver Burkeman. He is going to be around for the next 45 minutes or so. And then at the end, we're going to have some time for questions. If you have some questions for Oliver, just put them in the chat and we'll get to them. Here's a little more about him. Oliver worked for many years at The Guardian, where he wrote a popular weekly column on psychology called This Column Will Change Your Life. His books include the New York Times bestseller, 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals, and The Antidote, Happiness for People Who Can't Stand Positive Thinking. In his latest book, Meditations for Mortals, we have a liberating journey toward a more meaningful life. And we begin that journey not with the fantasy of who we'd like to be, but rather with the reality of where we find our own actual imperfect selves. Oliver, welcome back to The Thoughtful Bro.
It's great to be back. Thank you very much.
Well, last time we talked, you lived in Brooklyn. Now you live in the north of England. And I guess my question there is, in these last 3 years, you're somebody who spends a lot of time thinking about life and how to live life. In the last 3 years, is there anything you could point to that has changed, or were you just kind of distilling your wisdom to even more perfect little nuggets for us?
Anything that's changed? I mean, I just feel like it's such a sort of open-ended process. For me anyway, it often takes the form of a kind of a spiral. I hope it's a kind of a deepening spiral rather than that I'm just going around in circles. But one example of this that is kind of funny is that in 4,000 Weeks I wrote, among other things, about sort of overwhelm and busyness and the idea that our attempts to sort of get on top of things like email are sort of doomed to fail. We have to find some other way of living with these sort of infinite streams of things, because getting a finite person's arms around infinity is not going to work. And I felt like I got to a pretty good place with that kind of managing that kind of relationship between finite me and the infinite inputs. And then, lovely problem to have, but 4,000 Weeks did a lot better than I was expecting it to. And like the quantity of email I got just sort of shot up. And now I was like, oh, okay, now I've got to really, it keeps you honest, because you're sort of really putting to the test whether these ways of staying sane are really going to work. And, some of these ways of staying sane are also connected to staying sane in a kind of incredibly anxious and volatile, wider world. So really anything that happens in the news headlines, not that anything has recently that I'm aware of, but, anything is a new call to try to pressure test these ways of
you got to see, do you have the courage of your convictions to not answer that email? I mean, every time, I have to say, in the run up to this interview, every time I sent you an email, I felt like I was entering I was part of some test of yours. Will he answer
Other
this
people
email?
have said this. I it's not deliberate. The reason I take a long time to reply to emails is because I'm just not on top of my emails. The difference is that, at least sometimes that's a strategic decision. I try not to ignore, emails from readers and things like that. It's just that I also have realized that if I only prioritize getting them answered as quickly as possible, that is not always the recipe for.
Right. I love the image you had from the last book. It was like the infinite ladder, right? Like no matter how fast you climb the ladder, you're never going to get to the top. Anyway, so just tell us this new book, Meditations for Mortals. Just give us a kind of quick summary of what this book is about?
I guess that what I would say this book is about is it's about how to sort of cross that gap from knowing what you want to be doing in your life and how you want to be showing up in life to actually doing those things. You know, one piece of feedback that I got from 4,000 Weeks was that, you know, there was a kind of a powerful perspective shift that people were benefiting from, but then it's like, well, what do you do with that? How do you make it stick? How do you live differently if you come across a perspective on life that you appreciate? So the book is about that sort of crossing that gap from knowing to doing, but it's also trying to sort of be an instance of it, right? It's sort of structured in a way that is hopefully, if it works, going to carry people over that gap rather than just become another cool system to think about and maybe plan on putting into practice one day in the future. So it's about that, and the way to, and really what it's about is the approach to life that I call imperfectionism as a way of doing that.
Yeah. I would say preparing for this interview, it was actually a very difficult interview to prepare for, because I felt like after reading about 4 pages of this book, I had enough material to fill up 50 minutes of conversation. I mean, there's just so much packed into it. There's so much wisdom. There's so much humor. There's so much advice. And I just kind of wanted to immediately start talking to you about it after reading a couple pages. So I will say that it was hard for me to put this interview together, but just spoiler alert here, I think part of the way I want to structure this interview is I thought the most genuine way to go about talking to you about this would be for me to just tell you my own personal kind of foibles and my own personal hangups, and kind of turn this into like a therapy session based on your book. So be ready for that. But before we get to all that, the last book was called 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals. And here we have Meditations for Mortals. Twice the word mortals, not a word you see often in titles, I might add. Twice the word mortals coming up in the title. Why that word? Why is mortality something that you like to use to frame your advice?
Well, obviously there is a deliberate echo in the title of the new book with the subtitle of the last one. That can just be commercially wise.
I see.
The other thing that I kind of, who knows if anyone else finds this funny, but I find the idea of something being for mortals amusing, because it kind of it sounds like it's identifying the niche that the book is appropriate for, but the demographic is everybody who's going to die one day.
Right. Who is this for, really?
Right. Yeah. You got to know your audience. Okay. Anyone mortal. That's who it's for. But I think really, you know, it's not, neither of these books are books sort of explicitly about death and dying. There are some amazing books on that subject, but I haven't written them. I think what the relevance of that is simply that they are books about finitude. They are books about what it means to be intrinsically limited as a human being, in the amount of time you get, the amount of control you get over the time, the amount of knowledge you can have about the world or other people, and many other forms of limitation. And they all do ultimately come from the fact that we are mortal. Things would be very different, possibly a lot worse if we lived forever, or could be in multiple places at once and all the rest of it. So it's really that kind of, I'm really flagging up that notion of limitation is going to be central here. Now, my big claim is that embracing your limitations is not a matter of resigning yourself to a mediocre life, that it's actually the portal to having the most sort of accomplished, vivid and alive life you can. But that's why that is.
And tell me, like, what are you reacting to? I mean, a lot of the time you have, you know, you wrote another book called, what was it, like, self-help for people who hate positive thinking. It was sort of a reaction to the positive thinking industry, if you will. I mean, you describe yourself as a kind of recovering productivity geek. I feel like in a way this is a reaction to the productivity industry. But just tell me, like, give me a nice straw man. Like, who is, give me the embodiment of the person or the way of thinking that you're sort of writing against.
Yeah, I mean, it is against a certain conventional version of the productivity industry, but it is also against, or in some sense, trying to come to terms with something inside me, right? So I'm not writing this, as you say, as someone who like never fell for all that stuff and now is telling you the way it ought to be. It's like I am, to this day, on some level, totally capable of being seduced by a new app that promises to allow me to streamline my life in some way that I was not previously aware it needed streamlining. The straw man is, and I don't think it is a straw man, so I'll stop using that phrase. But the idea is, the thing I'm pushing back against is the idea that I think many of us feel, whether we articulate it consciously or not, which is that one day in the future, maybe soon, maybe it's going to be a while, we're going to somehow figure out we're going to figure out the way of sort of mastering life as a human in the 21st century. We're going to get on top of all the to-dos. We're going to figure out how to do our jobs, or how to be a parent, or how to be a spouse. We're going to sort of make ourselves not vulnerable to distressing emotions or unforeseen events. We're going to achieve a kind of security and control that after which, real life can finally begin. And I think it takes a million different forms for a million different people, right? So the productivity geek version of this is feeling that there must be a system that would make you so efficient and so optimized that life would be a breeze. You would be able to act on all the things you want to act on. You wouldn't need to let anybody down. You'd be able to be completely confident of your ability to handle anything that was thrown at you. But that's only one version. I think the underlying idea is this sense of this sort of mirage, this vision of security and plain sailing, and the sort of part of life where everything just is going to be problem free at last. And I want to say, it's never coming. Your struggle to get there is the thing that causes most of the misery. And when you let go of it, at least a little bit, it unleashes enormous energy and power to do the things that you care about, not later once you've fixed your personal problems, or figured out the system for productivity, or got rid of your imposter syndrome, but right here and now.
Yeah. It's just, it's such a seductive way of thinking, because it's so quantifiable, it's so measurable. We're so used to exploiting things. And, when we exploit something or try to put a system on something that is not us or not a human being, you get certain kinds of results, but those things are typically exploited not for a kind of well-being or happiness, right? And so when you try to turn that system inward on your own life and your own self, sometimes it's hard to get a kind of the intangible result of fulfillment or satisfaction with your life that you might get if you kind of say, I'm going to lay 20 bricks per day, and then at the end of the month, I'm going to have a wall. One of the biggest issues, I think, with the productivity mindset is that it is very hard in our culture to find dignity without being productive, to have a sense of self-worth. So, you look at the kind of who are our real popular culture heroes now, people like Elon Musk and Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg. It's very, certainly those are all controversial figures in their own way, but it would be hard to argue that they have enormous cultural influence, or that kind of, if somebody told you, I want to be the next Zuckerberg, Jobs, Musk, it'd be hard to kind of like not see where they're coming from, And so I just find, but it's very hard in our culture to find a language for somebody who is not productive and yet has value. They're not creating value, and yet they have value. Do you see, why is this so hard for us to kind of frame things that way?
Well, the why is fascinating, and we could probably talk about it for hours. I think it's very interesting. Probably in my own writing, I kind of tack back and forth a little unpredictably between either sort of agreeing that we shouldn't need to be productive in order to have value, or sort of redefining productivity in such a way that it incorporates a lot of things that we don't currently allow into that definition. So certainly, there are ways of there are so many ways of living, without sort of financial success that, for example, that have meaning and should probably in some sense be much more rewarded than they are.
Name one.
Well, just the job. I mean, the obvious thing is any sort of the work of caring in family settings or for elderly relatives or for something like that, right? This is a classic example of something that like isn't a job, but very much is a job.
Yeah.
And there are different proposals and ways of trying to recognize that. There are sort of European style welfare-based societies that sort of don't try to minimize the amount of money that is paid for people in those roles by the government, or there's universal basic income proposals, and there's all sorts of different ways of trying to sort of square this circle. But yeah, I think what it comes down to at the end of the day is that a lot of us as individuals, and then definitely as a society, we do have this kind of direct connection between worth and output, and not just any output, right? It usually is specific forms of output that are much better remunerated than others. And honestly, I'm not sure how much I have to say in the book about what you do about that on a sort of aggregate level. That seems like an enormous challenge, and one that is obviously very, very sort of relevant and topical in the immediate aftermath of the election over there.
Yeah.
On an individual level, this is where the book sort of begins, because I do feel like eventually we just have to start by modeling the world we want to see and the kind of people we want the world to be full of, rather than sort of just trying to engineer them into existence by some other means. So I write in the book about this feeling that so many of us have of waking up in the morning in a kind of productivity debt, where you haven't quite earned your right to exist unless you produce a certain amount. And of course, if you're in any form of employment, you do have a kind of debt of productivity, right? If you get a salary or wage, paycheck, you do have to do a certain number of things for that. But it's this sort of existential layer that we add, where we say, it's my very sort of worth as a human being that depends on that. And one of the traditional answers, and it's more of an answer in a more religious country like the United States than it is in a more secular one like the United Kingdom, is one of the answers has always been religion, right? One of the answers has always been some variety of saying, you have worth and you are loved before anything, before what you do. There are also, of course, branches of Christianity that have said something different and said, if you work really, really hard, you might get to heaven. But how we reinvent that for the secular age seems to me to be a really important question, because
absolutely,
most of us who are not religious cannot just decide to believe in God as a way of getting there. So I think it's a very, very important question what we do about that. And I suppose all I'm doing in this book is trying to say, well, you can start by cutting yourself a little bit of slack. You can start by seeing that it doesn't really make any sense, at least intellectually, right, to make your sense of adequacy dependent on how much you do. And you can entertain the possibility that actually you could make your productivity into an expression of your sense of adequacy, as it were, rather than as an attempt to win back that. You can say, like, what if you're sort of enough and okay to begin with? And then you do a bunch of stuff in the world because it's more fun to be alive that way.
I'll say, there's two, as I was thinking about this for myself, like, what are sources of my personal dignity that do not come from productivity? And so one of them was, you already sort of alluded to, with the care. I mean, I think good relationships, like maintaining good relationships throughout my life, the ability to work through problems in relationships with people who are close to me, people in my community. This is something that it makes me feel like it is worthwhile for me to be alive because I'm able to have these positive relationships. That is something that seems like beyond the reach of productivity. And the other one is something that you brought up in the book, called a life task. And that is something that, this is extremely personal to me, but, I left my job several years ago and decided to become a writer. And I think what's at the bottom of that, me chasing that dream, is that there's something inside me, which again is out of the reach of the kind of logic of capitalism, where I have just decided that if I write one great book in my life, that will have been worthwhile. And that is something that is, again, it's just not related to how many copies it would sell or how
Right.
long it takes, but it's something that I feel like I can devote my entire life to. And no one can make me doubt that that is worthwhile. So that spoke to me, the life task piece.
Yeah, that's a great way of thinking about it. And one sort of important distinction there to make, right, is that writing a great book could absolutely become a kind of condition of adequacy, and you could measure it by all sorts of metrics and then consider it a failure, or consider yourself a failure for not having gotten around to it. But the idea that there is a task that in doing it, almost regardless of the results, right, that in the doing of it, there is meaning. I think that's very, very important. And this life task idea comes from Carl Jung, really, but I somewhat freely adapt it. And it's really just this notion that at any given point in your life, there's something that your life is asking of you, maybe multiple things. And what's so powerful about this is it is sort of, if you think about that and you reflect on it and you come up with an answer or two to it, it's going to be something, it's very unlikely to be something particularly easy, right? It's going to be something that takes something out of you, that requires you to grow in some way. And most of us can think of a few things, I think, when we stop and consider it, in our work, in our relationships, wherever.
Yeah.
But it's also by definition going to be something doable. Like, it's not going to be that you need to start off by having several $1 million more than you have right now. It's not going to be that you should never have married that person in the past, right? Because that's in the past. It's going to be something that you can do in your life. And I think that's a really powerful notion, because there are some ideas about sort of destiny and life purpose abroad in the world of self-help, personal development, that don't have that piece. They sort of imply there's some answer to what you should be doing on the planet. And it's almost like you could suddenly discover that your life task was to be a, scuba diving instructor in Costa Rica, when in fact you're sort of absolutely, all sorts of reasons, economic, familial, and others, sort of keep you absolutely rooted to, suburbs of Frankfurt. I don't know, whatever. And that is very unhelpful, right? That notion that there's a life you're supposed to be living. No, you're living a life. And the question is, what's the next step in that life, which could take you in the end to scuba diving in Costa Rica, of course. But it's going to be something that you can address yourself to right here and now.
Yeah, I love that. All right, so now begins the therapy part of the conversation here. So I was just, as I was reading along, I was just trying to kind of identify. Sometimes, honestly, like sometimes I'd read something and I'd be like, oh, I don't really have an issue with that. Like, I feel like I've got that thing that you're bringing up figured out. But then you'd bring up other things and I'd think, oh, that hits a little close to home. So I got about 5 of them here where I think I'm not very good, and I have the wrong. Maybe wrong is the wrong word, but I have not highly gratifying mental habits regarding these topics. So let's start. Number 1, global warming. Okay, I love hot weather. I used to just love it, like even like 90 degrees, right? 90 degrees Fahrenheit. I used to love, obviously. I don't like 90 degrees Celsius, but anyway, so I love just trying to adapt for the fact that you're over in England. Yeah. Anyway, I used to love hot weather, and now, like, let's say we get it's like November 12th now. If it's been pretty warm here recently, but it's like I find myself, there's just an undercurrent of stress related to hot weather. And when it's not whatever I kind of anecdotally deem is like the right temperature for this time of year, if it's warmer than that, I used to just love it. But now I think, oh, this just shows that the world is going to hell in a handbasket. Tell me about the thinking about a problem that is so huge like that, and how can I kind of de-stress or think in a more productive way about that?
Wow, this is a fascinating question, and I'm trying to sort of, I'm hoping I'll come up with something, because I should say to anyone who doubts it or wonders about it, that I'm not a therapist of any variety or certification. I think one of the things that is so obvious in the context of climate change, but there are other examples of this as well, is that on the aggregate scale, it really is very easy to concern yourself with the issue at a level that you can do nothing about it. And that, as we know, going way back to the Stoics, is a recipe for sort of despair and stress, right? So it's not that you can't do anything about the climate, it's that something about the level at which we engage is almost deliberate, it's the very level that all we can really do is panic and or deny. And the same goes for sort of other things. Politics mediated through social media is a total story of this. And I think that the sort of Stoic idea of the dichotomy of control, the idea of understanding what it is that you can exert influence over and what it is that you can't, and sticking to the former is very powerful here, because it's a matter of that famous quote about how action is the antidote to despair. The reason that is true, I think, is because action, if it's action where you can hope to make a difference, it is something that respects the limitations of the body and the soul that you find yourself in, right? So it's a life task. Now, I accept that if what that is for you is volunteering in a local context, that's going to feel like it's not a big part of the sort of aggregate problem. It might be something much more, it might be, there are all sorts of high profile ways of being involved in that issue that some people do, right? In terms of, working for non-governmental organizations or doing sort of civil disobedience demonstrations or whatever. The point is, it's almost none of your business, I suppose, is what I'm getting at here. It's almost none of your business what effect that has on the thing that is larger than you. The point is, in order to feel that you're doing something meaningful, the point is that you are taking the actions that your limited nature allows. I don't feel like I've probably saved you from the stress of climate change here.
No, I mean, it's about sort of managing despair, and I think what I hear you saying is that there is a way to do something to kind of manage your despair. But if you decide to engage on a level of like, a thunderstorm is coming, why can't I personally stop the thunderstorm? I mean, there just are things that are impossible for a human being to do. And I think you had in your newsletter, The Imperfectionist, which is terrific, by the way, and we'll put some links to that in the chat. You had a column the other day about reacting to the election, and you had a number of kind of wise pieces of advice for people who feel, if they're on that side of things, they feel despair about the way the election turned out. And I mean, this is sort of a nice pivot into that. It's a similar kind of thing, because I think there's a way that social media can just make a person feel like, well, if I'm not doing something, if I'm not, for example, just being on social media more, if I'm not commenting about this or posting about this, or if I'm not showing support for this group or, showing my disdain for that group, I am like part of the problem. Mm-hmm. Silence is complicity. I mean, there is a total kind of way of thinking about this kind of doing something and the compulsion to do something that is rife on social media. And just what are your thoughts about kind of like having an attitude of despair about what can I do or what should I have done, in regards to somebody reacting to the election?
I mean, I made a few points in that. I did a couple of newsletters, one just before and one just after the election. And I made a few points, but several of them do sort of target social media, I think, because there is something about the way that works. There's a philosopher called Byung-Chul Han who has written about how, in very many ways, the internet doesn't kind of create this public sphere for us all to debate and discuss things in, but it just sort of merges. It gives each of us sort of unmediated access to everybody else's private spheres in a way, the sort of insides of their brains, in a way that is sort of tormenting and enraging. But again, you can't really get anywhere with it. You can't hope to sort of resolve the differences that are at the core of our polarization. And I think it's incredibly important to understand how that polarization is what breeds a lot of the worst of our politics, right? What they need, the people that you really hate or dislike, the powerful people, I mean, not the people who vote for them, need you to be outraged with them for the whole operation to work. So there is a kind of self-sustaining awfulness about that. One of the points I made, and so I was sort of making this case in one of these aspects of this newsletter for sort of a greater dose of physical, local, immediate, embodied reality in our lives. That was one of the things that I suddenly sort of snapped into focus for me quite quickly after last Tuesday, was like, I think it is time to stop pretending that I haven't lived too long in these sort of ethereal realms of cyberspace. I know this can sound very sort of Luddite and nostalgic, but I think there is a case not for giving up technology, but for understanding that the only point of all of this has got to be to help us spend more time gathering in person and in public and connecting to other people and looking other people in the eye and, actually being, a community and a polity. And then the other thing I wanted to say in that newsletter was, people find this potentially objectionable and it makes them, angry, but like, it's really not possible. One of the ways in which we're limited as humans is you cannot tell whether any given event in the world is for the best or not in the long run. And, taking also the position of someone who wishes the US election hadn't gone the way that it went, it's totally feasible that this kind of shock result could be the start of a kind of renewal and regeneration in politics that led to everything being a lot less polarized and harsh than it is at the moment. It's totally possible that when people win elections, and squeak victories, they get complacent, and then far worse catastrophes are just delayed by a few years. There's all sorts of things, and you can never know. And it's important to respect that sort of limitation that we have about what we can know, not because it means like everything will turn out for the best in the end, but because it really does return your focus to like, okay, let's do the things that we can do, and take the actions that we can take, and sort of ease up a little bit on being so sure that we know how these big forces are going to turn out in the end.
Yeah, I have a friend named Alex, and she posted on Facebook a couple days after the election. She's like, "Hey guys, I'm actually going to get off social media for a while." And she's like, "I just want to say this. Look up." She put it in all caps. Look up. She's like, "The world is not on your phone. The world is out there." And I just think I was thinking about that as you were talking just now. And that really summed up a lot about how I felt about the election too. It's like, I think like 95 to 99% of the way people consumed the politics of this election was through a screen. Right. And it didn't have anything to do with what was going on in their community or with their neighbor or, literally at their school. I mean, sometimes it did, but about 95% of the feelings and time we spent on it was just staring at our phone. And yeah, it's just, in a way, it's just not what's real. So look up is my big thing going forward. All right, hold on. I want to keep going with my therapy session here. I want to get my money's worth here, Oliver. All right. So here's another thing that's sort of particular to me. So I told you earlier about my life task, wanting to write one great book. That just seems like the thing I want to do. But I only published my first book earlier this year. I'm in my 40s, and there is a lot of stress that I have about being a late bloomer. I think it might even be kind to call me a late bloomer. I mean, like, is this even blooming at all? I mean, it's like nudging up my little bud through the soil here. I mean, has it really bloomed yet? Will it ever bloom? But anyway, I look out at people who, like, the wunderkinds of the world and the people who are like my age, who have done so much more than me. And it fills me with like angst and bitterness and just like, why did it take me so long? Why? I wanted this to happen a long time ago, but it just didn't. And then I start, feeling bad about myself and so on. So give me some thinking from this book that might help a person with that.
Wow, interesting. Let me ask you first, was there a section of the book that you felt was relevant specifically to this? Because you didn't. I'm interested because you described sort of, thinking you didn't have an issue with certain chapters and certain. I mean, to me, this all speaks to the idea of kind of the moment of truth in the future, right? The moment of arrival, the moment of life not being provisional anymore. But if that's not what you're thinking of, then
No, it is. It is. I mean, I think there is a way that I have always felt like I'm waiting for my real life to begin. My life as like a great author, and like where is that life? And does my life mean anything if I have been on the planet this long and I'm still not there?
Right. It's really, it's fascinating. And I guess it's just it's a very specific and sort of sharply defined version of something that I think on some level afflicts us all, which is this notion that, something is going to happen, some problem is going to be fixed, some deficit is going to be filled, and then the real part of life can begin. And I think that, this is a relatively defensible thing to feel if you're sort of 19 or 20, right? Because with a bit of luck, the vast majority of your life is ahead of you.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons that people who are more like, in our 40s have midlife crises is that it gets harder and harder to maintain the belief that that thing is coming later once you're aware that you're sort of in the middle of the sort of average lifespan. So, and is one still going to be at 70 thinking that the moment of truth is around the corner, or 80? Where does it stop? I think that it's a sort of deeply understandable thing, and it comes from, as we've already discussed here today, it comes from this notion that there's something that has to be in place before you will sort of allow yourself to be fully in your life. And I think that a big part of that is that there's some standard that you're holding yourself to that probably is not attainable by anybody, right? So it's not necessarily, of course, you could write more books and they could be incredibly successful. That is attainable. But the thing that you're wanting from that, whether it's a sort of public acclaim or money or just the deep sense that you have fully realized your potential, whatever it is, right, is actually some other infinite supply that none of which would be satisfying. And I quote in the book a great writer called Sasha Chapin, who talks about the sort of remarkable transformation of wanting. It's very apt for your particular question, right? Of wanting in his 20s to be a novelist on a par with David Foster Wallace. That was his sort of hero. Realizing that it wasn't going to happen, or not in that way anyway, and finding himself in a situation that he describes as playing in the ruins, right? Of actually finding it incredibly liberating and empowering to be like, okay, life isn't going to work out the way I wanted it to work out. And that means that I don't need to put any effort into holding up that facade anymore. Now, we should be careful with the parallel here. I don't mean to imply that it's off the table for your books to be staggeringly successful and you to be remembered for
Thank you.
That's not off the table. What's off the table is for you to publish an incredibly successful book in your early 20s, say, if you didn't do that thing, right? And there's something lovely about seeing that, right? There's something deeply relaxing, or at least potentially deeply relaxing, to be accessed in the idea that, like, as Chapin says, right, your absurd back of the napkin sketch for how your life was going to go didn't go that way. Well, like, who'd have thought that might be how things turned out? And actually, there's a release in that, because you can sort of put that down and you can more playfully move forward, seeing that, in some sense, all life is a kind of crumbling of dreams, right? That's a terribly depressing way of putting it. But actually, what's happening in those crumblings is that you're stepping more fully into the life you do have. So I think it's quite useful just to sort of be much more didactic than a therapist ever would be, to see that the issue here is something that you would sort of transfer onto the next book or the next goal or the next thing, right? It isn't going to be satisfied by any specific concrete achievement in the world.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it's sort of an unresolvable thing in me, and like,
right.
you know,
and that's relief. That's liberating, because then it's like, okay, that's just a little thing I have, and we all have our little thing. Meanwhile, I'm going to write stuff because that's something that makes me feel alive, you know.
Another huge part of the book is about change, and sort of you talk. I mean, I was thinking about it when you were talking a moment ago, because you were talking about kind of embracing the fact that you know, you are kind of making the most of playing in the ruins, as it were, like something. So that's sort of on the side of, well, things can't be changed. This is something, it's sort of some fact about life that's just impossible to change, and it just is this way. But there's other things in life that you talk about, you know, about people kind of getting over a hump. Sometimes people tell themselves it's impossible to change, but actually it isn't. And I think it's, in some ways, a lot of, you know, when you talk about each one of those, it sort of boils down to this serenity prayer, you know, the famous, give us the serenity to accept what we cannot change, the courage to change what we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And I guess I just wanted to talk about that, the specific thing, because like, people, change is such a topic, and a lot of the reason why people read books like this is so they can change their lives. But I guess help us like identify, how do you know when a problem really is something that cannot be changed? And when is it when might we detect it's actually something that we're only saying is impossible, but actually maybe we could do something about? Does that question make sense?
It does, but it makes me want to respond that these things are more closely connected than we tend to assume, right? There's something about acceptance of what can't be changed that is the very thing that gets life moving and gets change happening. And there is that famous line from Carl Rogers, the humanistic psychotherapist: the curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change.
Wait,
and
let's unpack that. I mean, you're about to, clearly, but I'm very interested.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it's a matter of looking at this problem or that problem and saying, well, that one is not changeable, but that one is changeable. I think it is probably a much more sort of close-in matter of, you know, taking a next step and taking another next step and taking another next step. And in the midst of that, I think it is really useful to sort of look at any thing that feels like a big problem and to ask yourself, like, what if this was never going away, right? What if this was always going to be a part of my life, especially with sort of personality traits and things like that, right? What if I'm always going to be a bit of a procrastinator? What if I'm always going to have a short temper? And a lot of the time, I think in contemplating that, people feel a sort of unexpected freedom, because you suddenly think like, oh, okay, well, if that's always going to be around, I can kind of just coexist with it and try and be friendly towards it and get on with the things that I want to be doing in my life. So I think when it's that kind of problem, it's a sort of thing you want to change about yourself. It can be really useful to ask it, that wonder if maybe being okay with never changing is actually the sort of first step to getting somewhere. I mean, there's a different sense in which you can think about change, right? Which is sort of life choices. Do I stay or do I go from this relationship or this job or something like that? And that probably calls for a slightly different approach. I've written before about this question from James Hollis, the Jungian psychotherapist, who asks whether a given choice, you should ask whether a given choice enlarges or diminishes you.
In what sense enlarges or diminishes?
Well, I think he doesn't say, and it's kind of
Mm.
deliberate, right? It's sort of it's a connection to your intuitions, right? It's a sort of saying, well, is this the path of growth or not? And one thing that I think is so helpful about that is that, you know, there are certain kinds of problem you can experience in a job or a relationship or other contexts, which are signs that you should get out, right? Red flags, reasons to believe that this is not where you should be. And then there's another kind, which is totally unpleasant in many ways, but is part of the challenge. It's part of why you're there, and it's sort of growth oriented. And I think that Hollis question helps distinguish between those two, because, you know, a direction in which you're planning to go in life might not strike you as the most fun, but you can usually intuit whether you're likely to grow as a result of it, or whether you're going to sort of shrivel as a result of it. So I think that's another important way of thinking about this. And I guess what unites all of this really is just that we're talking about navigating moment to moment in terms of what life seems to be asking in that moment, rather than kind of engineering a solution. Okay, these problems aren't solvable, these ones are, I'm going to attack those, and when I get past them, everything's going to be great. It's like there's some misunderstanding built into that of what it really is to be here, which is just to put, you know, one foot after the other, and as Jung says, do the next and most necessary thing. And then
I love that. I've always loved that quote. And I've found, like, I mean, that is something that was one of the things I read in the book. And I thought, oh, I sort of do that already. I just find when I'm tired and confused or stressed or kind of having vague foreboding feelings about the future, I just say, okay, just think of anything that you absolutely have to do.
Yeah.
And whatever it is, it's like, you got to put on your shoes, like whatever.
Yeah.
Just do that thing first, and then see what happens next. Okay, so
yes. And that is a lesson from Frozen too, as well. It's do the next right do the next right thing. It's Anna, Queen Anna, isn't it?
There you go.
So if you prefer the knowledge from that source, you're welcome.
All right. So one more question from me, and then we have a question from the audience that we'll take too, and then we'll wrap. But you know, there's this phrase that's used, at least in kind of the marketing of the book. I can't remember actually how much this particular word is used in the book, but the idea of a meaningful life, having a meaningful life. Now, Richard Dawkins, your fellow countryman, is famous for ridiculing the idea of a meaningful life. And he says the idea of having a meaningful life is a nonsensical question. He compares it to the question, what is the color of jealousy? He's like, just because something can be phrased in the form of a question doesn't mean that it makes sense or is logical or has an answer. And he puts what's the meaning of life into that category. And you know, I'm not trying to be cute with this, or I'm not trying to pin that on you, if in case you feel that maybe that's more of a word that's used more in the marketing of your book than something that you passionately feel. But I just want you to, in some way, I mean, describe the meaningful life. Describe like the life, you know, give me the opposite of the straw man here. What does that life look like to you?
Well, I certainly have used the phrase a meaningful life or a life of meaning. I do think, and I think I say as much in certain places, it's pretty much a placeholder for something that you know when you are experiencing it or when you have experienced it. And maybe meaningful is a strange way of talking about it. Meaning is a very curious concept in all its applications. But there is, and even Richard Dawkins, I'm sure, experiences a kind of enriching absorption in and engagement with life that is something we sometimes feel and sometimes we don't feel. So we know we have that sense that it's there, that sense of being sort of fully or more fully present and alive, that a feeling of aliveness. I think I love what Joseph Campbell says somewhere about how people think they're looking for a meaning of life, but actually they're looking for a feeling of aliveness. And it's even that doesn't really make sense, because obviously we're always all alive until we're not. But and yet it's something that people know what you mean when you say that. In the new book, I draw on the work of a German social theorist called Hartmut Rosa and talk about resonance as a way of capturing this thing. And he's very eloquent on how so many of our attempts to kind of get more control of life actually squeeze the resonance out of it.
Yeah.
So as for what this looks like, I do sort of resist answering that question of, it seems to invite a kind of a laundry list, right? Sort of like, these are the things that you should be doing in your life. And the funny thing about that is, on the one hand, it's so personal. So I don't think I've got much to say to anybody about it. On the other hand, it's sort of almost completely generic. Like, you just know that list, right? It's like better social relationships, more time in nature, time to play as well as to work, meaningful work. There you go. I guess, absorbing work or something, work that feels like it's making a difference to something. Everyone knows it's those things. And that doesn't seem, just knowing that it's those things doesn't seem to solve the problem of building a life like that. So I really think it is more a question of learning to navigate by what makes you feel most alive, which doesn't mean that you sort of engineer or design a life that is only full of that, but it does mean that you're more conscious when it's not there, and you can navigate back to it because you know the things that tend reliably to bring it about.
Yeah.
And it can come up in surprising places, right? I think it's entirely feasible that keeping your house nice and orderly and staying current with your email, all sorts of things that don't fall into the sort of high spiritual experiences of life, can be a part of that sort of wide-rangingly engaging and absorbing life, where you're sort of attending to the various different businesses that you have in your world that add up to a life well lived.
I do. I mean, I love this notion of enlarging and feeling kind of like a spiritual, if you will, enlargement, and like that. That's kind of the direction of a life better lived. But I will also say that on a day when you knock it out and you get all the errands done, you get all the emails answered, there is that kind of, you get into bed with this feeling of like, I really did it. It does make you feel larger in a certain way. You don't want to be ruled by that, but it does.
No, I think you're totally right. And I always, there's a kind of an idea afoot in sort of entrepreneurial hustle culture world that says, that says like there are certain things that are valuable because you make money out of them and you enjoy doing them, or you enjoy doing them, and everything else you should try to sort of outsource if you possibly can. And I always push back against that because, when I'm writing and doing something very deep and profound and important, and then I get up and take a break, folding a bit of laundry, emptying the dishwasher, this has its place. It's a modulation of the pace. It's not necessarily it's not necessarily something to be eliminated.
Yeah. All right. So quickly, we have a couple questions from the audience, but I'll just take this one, which I really like. This is from Margaret. What if instead of, quote, figuring it out, humanity is running itself off a cliff? When we discover that's the path we're on, how do we process that and keep living? And certainly this question was asked within the context of hyperproductivity and kind of making the most of every minute. But what if that's taken us toward a cliff?
I mean, if we one day as a civilization sort of bring about our own total demise, then I suppose if you sort of fast forward to that moment, then that's what will have happened. But meantime, which is what the question I think is really about, it's about functioning now with this being a possibility in our of what we're doing. I think it's really helpful to understand and to remind ourselves that on some level, this has always been true, right? It's not I'm not trying to say there's nothing new about our particular cocktail of, climate, nuclear, AI, and anti-democratic politics all coming together. But it is the case, as C.S. Lewis famously said in the sermon that he gave in the Second World War, that humanity has always lived on the edge of a precipice. It's just that it's possible for large stretches to sort of ignore that fact. And everyone in that boat, including, everyone ever in history has had to accomplish anything worthwhile, have any fun they've ever had, have had any spiritual experiences they've ever had, raise any children they've ever raised. They've always had to do it in that situation, in that sort of groundless state of not knowing what the future will bring. And of course, in many isolated specific contexts, in certain medieval times or whatever, the devastation in the form of the plague or whatever it might be could just completely be that catastrophe for those people. So I really like this idea that I'll be quick, but I really like this idea that the eco philosopher Derek Jensen has about not needing hope in all this mix, that we can sort of do the things we do out of love for the planet and for other people and for the activities that make us feel alive. That's why you do it, right? You don't do it because you can be sure of a good outcome. You don't do things for your children on the condition, or you shouldn't do, on the condition that they become a certain kind of successful adult. You do it because you love them. Yeah. And that it might be possible to take that attitude, at least aspirationally, to the whole reality that we're in right now.
I love that. That's a wonderful, wonderful answer. And just kind of thinking about doing it for what you love right now, not for what outcome you hope for. I think it's, a deeply spiritual idea too. Oliver, this has been great. Folks, the book is called Meditations for Mortals, 4 weeks to embrace your limitations and make time for what counts. By the way, we didn't mention this, but you can also read this book 1 chapter per day over 28 days and kind of make it a kind of mental retreat. Oliver, before we go, one last question for you. I ask this to everybody who comes on the show. Just imagine that there is an ideal reader for this book, and they've just finished reading it after 4 weeks, or in my case, after 2 days. And they close the book, they put it in their lap. Describe what kind of feeling that you would hope that this reader has.
I would hope that they felt much more peaceful and calm, but in that specific way that is accompanied with energy and sort of a readiness to dive into something, and that they would be willing, having closed the book, to spend 10 minutes on the activity or the project or the relationship that they know needs their attention, and not out of some sort of desire to plug a gap or fill a void of adequacy, but just because it will be a fun way to be alive.
You know what? On that note, right when we finish this, I'm going to go play basketball with my son outside. And there's no productivity in that. It's just something that I feel like he will love and I will love. And that's what I'm going to do.
Do it. Brilliant.
Oliver, thank you so much. The book is called Meditations for Mortals, folks. It's wonderful. Oliver, thank you for making time for us on the show today. And any quick hint on what might be the next Mortals title that we'll see, or when we might see it?
I haven't figured this out. I think maybe it'll be time to retire the For Mortals brand, but we'll see. Who knows?
All right. Well, thank you for being with us, Oliver. And folks, we'll see you next time on Thoughtful Bro.